Imagine a world woven together by trade, a world where letters, gifts, and soldiers moved along routes that stretched from the Nile Delta to the Aegean Sea, a world of bronze and brilliance. LinkedIn's This was the late Bronze Age, and it was, for its time, a globalized civilization. An Egyptian pharaoh writes to a Hittite king, not with threats, but to wish him good health. Tin from Afghanistan is alloyed with Cypriot copper to make the weapons that defend Greek citadels. It was a system, a complex, thriving, and deeply fragile system. And then it collapsed. Not in a century, not in a generation, but in the blink of an eye. Around 1177 BC, the lights went out. Across the entire eastern Mediterranean, the palaces were burned, not just in war, but abandoned, as if the people who ran them had simply vanished. In Mycenaean Greece, the great palace fortresses, Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae itself, were put to the torch, their linear B script forgotten for centuries. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite Empire, a superpower that rivaled Egypt, vanished from history. Their capital, Hattusa, was left empty, a ghost city for the mountains to reclaim. And in Egypt, the pharaohs themselves carved desperate prayers into stone. They begged their gods for salvation from an unstoppable, mysterious force sweeping in from the sea peoples. This is the story of the single greatest disaster in human history. An apocalypse so complete it was forgotten for 3,000 years. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. To understand the collapse, you must first know the pillars that held this world up. Four great powers, locked in a delicate dance of diplomacy, trade, and occasional war. First, the glistening kingdom on the Nile, Egypt. Under the Ramesside pharaohs, it was at the zenith of its wealth and power. Monumental temples at Karnak and Luxor, their walls adorned with tales of gods and kings, were not just places of worship. They were the administrative and economic engines of a state that believed itself eternal. Fascism becomes more grounded, pragmatic. To the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, lay the Hittite Empire. If Egypt was the divine monarch, the Hittites were the pragmatic masters of statecraft and law. Their capital, Hattusa, was a formidable fortress city, protected by walls of Cyclopean stone. They were the first to master ironworking on a large scale, holding the secret close. Their king was not a god, but a first among equals, a fascinating contrast. Across the wine-dark sea, in the Peloponnese, the Mycenaean Greeks ruled from their palace fortresses. These were the people of the legendary Agamemnon. Their society was militaristic, organized, and wealthy. They kept their records in a script we call linear B, lists of spices, chariots, and soldiers. They were the western anchor of this world, trading with everyone, from Sicily to the Levant. And in the shadows, watching, waiting, were the Assyrians. Nestled in the upper Tigris, they were the rising, ambitious power. They were the wolves at the gate, often contained by the Hittites or Mitanni, but never truly tamed. Their time had not yet come, but their presence was a constant, low-pressure threat on the Hittite eastern flank. And these empires were not isolated. They were deeply, inextricably linked. Animated maps showing diplomatic exchanges between the capitals. We have the evidence. The Amarna letters, a trove of clay tablets found in Egypt. Here, the pharaoh Amenhotep III corresponds with the king of Babylon, complaining that the gold he sent was not of the finest quality. The Hittite king writes to the Egyptian king, addressing him as "my brother." They speak of royal marriages, of exchanging doctors and sculptors. This was a club of kings, a globalized superpower structure. It was a brilliant, interconnected world, a world that worked, and it was about to fail. It's still low serious. The first warnings were not armies on the horizon. They were quieter, more insidious. The environment itself began to turn against them. Lush green landscapes of the eastern Mediterranean slowly morphing into dry, cracked, yellowed earth. Tree rings from Anatolia and pollen samples from the seabed tell a unanimous, terrifying story. A prolonged mega-drought began to grip the region around 1200 BC. For decades, the rains failed. The harvest shrank. Imagine the anxiety. A farmer watching his fields wither. A merchant seeing the price of grain skyrocket. A king watching his tax revenues, the lifeblood of the state, dry up. Famine stalked the land. The social contract, the very thing that held these complex kingdoms together, began to fray. One urgent, and then the earth shook. Animated tectonic plates shifting, stone walls crumbling in slow motion. Rapid, intense. This region sits on a tectonic nightmare. Geological evidence shows a period of intense seismic activity. Not one earthquake, but a storm of earthquakes, ripping through the Aegean and Anatolia. The mighty walls of Mycenaean and Tiryns, walls so thick they were said to be built by giants, were shattered. Hattusa's foundations were cracked. A drought is a slow crisis. An earthquake is a fast one. But when a society is hit by both, in rapid succession, it becomes a system-level shock. The palaces, the centralized authorities who stored and redistributed food, were no longer seen as providers. They were seen as failures. The first domino had been tipped. Act 3, The Dark Age and the Legacy. Segment, The World After. Differing, a desolate landscape, ruins of a palace being slowly overgrown by vines. What quiet, haunting. What followed was a silence that lasted for centuries. We call it the Greek Dark Age, but the darkness fell everywhere. The intricate arts were lost, the skill of fresco painting, of carving intricate seals, of inlaying gold and ivory, gone. Architecture became smaller, cruder. The grand bureaucratic palace economy was replaced by local, subsistence-level farming. The most important point, delivered with weight, and most catastrophically of all, writing was forgotten. Linear B in Greece, cuneiform Hittite in Anatolia, the Cypriot script, all gone. When a society loses its ability to write, it loses its memory. It loses its laws, its literature, its receipts, its history. It becomes local, isolated. The collective hard drive of civilization was wiped clean. For 400 years, the stories of the Trojan War, of the great kings, were not written down. They were only whispered around campfires, distorted by time, becoming myth. Segment, The Rebirth, 42 minutes to 48 minutes. Visual, a single small green shoot growing from the cracks of a massive ruined wall. Tone begins to lift, hopeful. But from the ashes, something new began to grow. The collapse of the rigid, top-down Bronze Age palaces created a vacuum, and nature, and human nature, abhors a vacuum. Visual, map showing new, smaller city-states emerging in Greece and Phoenicia, explaining. Without the overbearing control of a Mycenaean wanax, communities had to govern themselves. In Greece, this led to the rise of the polis, the independent city-state, the very incubator of Athenian democracy. The loss of access to tin forced a technological revolution, the widespread adoption of iron. It was more common, more democratic. Every village could have its own smith. And on the Levantine coast, the survivors, the Phoenicians, took to the sea, not as raiders, but as the greatest traders and colonizers the world had yet seen. They perfected the alphabet, a writing system so simple it could break the priestly monopoly on literacy. The world that emerged from the Dark Age was not a faded copy of the Bronze Age. It was something entirely new, more dynamic, and more resilient. The world of classical Greece, of Rome, of the Bible, was born in the fiery ruin of the Bronze Age collapse. Segment, Conclusion and CTA, 48 to 50 minutes. Marital returns, a hopeful but still solemn version of the main theme. Visual, a split screen. On one side, the interconnected Bronze Age world map. On the other, a modern, glowing map of global air routes and internet connections. So, what is the lesson of 1177 BC? It is not that civilizations are doomed to fall. It is that complex, interconnected systems are fragile. They are vulnerable to what we now call multi-system collapse. It is rarely one thing. It is the convergence of climate stress, internal social unrest, and external shock, making the connection. They had their first internet. We have ours. They faced climate change. We face ours. They were blindsided by a global crisis they could not comprehend. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is not a dusty relic. It is a warning, a lesson in humility. It tells us that no civilization, no matter how golden, no matter how seemingly eternal, is immune to the tides of history. The only question that remains is, are we listening? Fades to black.